Thank you, Kiran. That was a very kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. I think I'm going to need a little bit of help getting my presentation here. Who's the boss? Well, it's lovely to see all of you. Unfortunately, this room has got just the right temperature, humidity, darkness level to induce what is not going to be good for this presentation. So you should stand up and stretch a little bit and take a deep breath because you'll have quite a long session and really, really interesting presentations coming up after me. Ah, there's a good idea. Was the temperature specially ordered for you? Welcome to summer in South Africa. It wasn't always this hot, I promise you. But this is what climate change can do. Colleagues, thank you for the opportunity. And let me, at the outset, say congratulations, because this is the inaugural SADC Groundwater Confrence. And this means that there are many more to come. And we are really glad at the Water Research Commission that this is indeed the case. Because groundwater, as you will know, is neglected. It's neglected at the level of implementation. Some people are trying to right-track that, as you can see with the South African National Water and Sanitation Master Plan. It's also neglected at the level of knowledge investment, and it's neglected at the level of practitioner investment. And South Africa found this out in the hardest possible way during our recent drought. We were scrambling around, literally, fighting to find expertise to be able to alleviate aspects of the drought and invest in groundwater resources. And I hope this conference, and many like it, are going to change the tide, it's going to change the conversation and organize for us to be collectively in a much better space. Now the first thing you'll have to do is, excuse me, I am going to take this jacket off. Is that all right? No, yes. Thank you. Don't worry, be assured I'm not going to take anything else. You've already been kind enough to use a very old picture of me in your catalogue. I looked at this person and I can't remember when I looked like that. Mind you, you looked a bit different as well. It changes. It changes. So guys, what I want to share with you is the issue around the water, energy, food security nexus in the SADC region. It has great promise. There are some important difficulties to overcome, and I thought we could remunerate a little bit to one another and contextualize the nature of the challenge that we face and where groundwater fits into it. I'm not going to venture deeply into the field of groundwater. The expertise in this room is probably better than most places in the world, and certainly better than mine, so I'm not going to preach to you about something that you've been teaching me about, but I want to set out a bit of context. To start with, on this first slide, there is a picture there which I think is important. I hope you can see it. I know it's a bit blurry. But it is something that has been described to us in the last WISA conference. We had a delegation and a keynote from the Director General of the CSTD in India, which is a very big environmental lobby with a lot of power globally. And they've been examining this phenomenon around the world, the phenomenon of extreme weather. And the phrase that they use is floods in the time of droughts. Now, we in the SADC region know this very well. We know this extremely well. We have had extreme weather events of both kinds, of dryness and wetness in the same locality. And the difficulty around how to deal with that is actually close to impossible. And this describes, if you like, the nature of the challenge that we face. I didn't mean to go to the end. So I'll try myself at the beginning again. So I thought I would start at this point. One of the things that is defining the agenda in the SADC region, as it is defining the agenda in so many parts of the world, is of course the SDGs. So as we are sitting here in this conference, not very far away from us, less than 5 kilometers away at Empress Palace, AfriSAN is meeting, where delegates from all over Africa are sitting down and analyzing, taking a pulse indicator of where they are with the SDGs, and analyzing what the nature of the constraints are and where we need to be going and how we need to get there. And where we are with the SDGs is actually quite close. For me, it's always confusing to get into discussions where people talk about the SDGs as being some kind of future enterprise. Well, we're sitting in 2018. We're not far from the end of 2018. It means we've got 11 years to go to reach this target. And the bottom line for a place like Africa is that this is only half the job. Because the really big job is the step in a much longer journey. So while we want to organize for us in the water sector to have universal access to clean water and safe and dignified sanitation for all of the people by 2030, we have to do it in a way that organizes for us to have the right kind of mechanics at play so that we can retain that target when there are 10 billion of us on this planet in 2050. When in 2050, this may well be the most populous continent on Earth with the highest growth rate. Now, this is a very interesting challenge. The first thing that it means is that the conventional way of doing things is not going to work. It might help us to reach the short-term target. It's certainly not going to be sustainable in the long term. Now, we have good experience of this in the South African environment, where we made phenomenal strides in the first 5 years of democracy around increased access to water in particular, not so much in sanitation, and had difficulty in sustaining that because we did not use the right kind of models around it. And this is the nature of the challenge. The SDGs also find themselves in a place that is determining many other things in the world. And one of the places that we don't often look at is the private sector. And an example of how the private sector is looking at the world comes from this map. I hope it's familiar to you. If it's not, it's free on a download from the World Economic Forum. And the World Economic Forum every year puts out a global risk register. This is the one from last year. The one from this year looks pretty similar, but there are some important differences. And this is what is considered the global threats to the global economy. Now, the first thing I want to point out is that while the boardroom discussions happen in parallel to the public sector discussions, and many of you are from the public sector, there are important connectors around this. Because while the global economy players are looking at competitiveness as a primary indicator, and we in the public service talk about quality of life as our primary indicator, the intersection is absolutely stark. So one of the things that we've done is done an overlay of the SDGs and their relationship with the key factors associated with the global risk register, and you can see that the fit is really very good. Because in the context of the global challenges to the global economy, it's exactly the kind of things that we talk about as our challenges in the public sector environment. It's the issues of water crisis. It's the issue of climate-related disasters. It is the issue around migration, the issues around energy, the issues around biodiversity loss. These are all the fundamental indicators that have found different expressions in different parts of the environment, and the Global Risk Register is a really, really important tool that will organize for us to come a lot closer together and bring our resources to bear in a coordinated way around addressing the challenge. Now, we have seen some of this happen in the last 5 years in South Africa. We've seen some of this happen in other parts of SADC, and there's some very interesting examples of what is possible around how people have used new and innovative technology, new and innovative ways of engaging groundwater resources around organizing for the long-term sustainability, not only of countries, not only of regions, but of single economic enterprises, like mines, for example, like hotel chains as another example. And this is a really important overlap that we have to continuously examine. The other thing I'd like to bring to your attention is that although you won't find this in any of the documentation from the World Economic Forum, it is also describing in that global risk register, as it has been doing for the last 10 years, 3 key components that far too seldom are thought of together. That's the water issue, in this case recognized as the water crisis. A crisis is assurance of supply. The issue of the food crisis in the world, and not just about the availability of food, but also about the distribution of food and the access to food, and the energy price shock. And the energy price shock has many dimensions. One of those dimensions is related to the price of oil, but there are many other dimensions associated with the price of access to power in any given way. So the water, energy, food nexus, which is the thing that I want to emphasize, is something that you will find in even the most unexpected places. And I think from next year's report, because we have made submissions in this regard, even places like the World Economic Forum, places like the World Bank, places like the African Development Bank are going to start describing the nature of this joint challenge that we have around the water, energy, and food nexus. The other thing that I want to draw to your attention, associated with the risk register, are the climate-related risks. Now, the top right-hand quadrant in this map talks about those things that have the highest likelihood of occurrence and the highest impact. And you can see all of the top risks that are on the global risk register are very intimately related to climate change. Now, there are some places in the world that are currently in climate change denial. SADC is not one of those regions in the world. We have been living out the changes in climate for the past at least 10 years, probably longer than that, in the severest of ways. We have had more extreme weather events in a decade that had previously occurred in a century. And this close compact of the extreme weather events is as a direct result of the climate change scenarios. We also know that all of the climate change scenarios that have been computed say that the minimum effect for the SADC region is a +2 degree scenario. That's the minimum. The more likely is a 4-degree scenario, and if we're really bad about what we're doing, as a globe, because we can't independently determine this, we may go even higher than that. So just imagine the hottest day that you've experienced, and add a couple of degrees to that. This will become the new norm. So colleagues, we are living in extreme times. And to expand this a little bit further, the 21st century Malthusian challenge is described by these 3 parameters. The first of the parameters is the nature of the population dynamic. And in a place like Africa, in a place like SADC, which has a very youthful population growth, just the growth, is a key factor. We are destined to be that part of the world that by 2050 will have 25% more people than we currently have on this continent. The second is that this is one of the rapidly developing parts of the world. So every year, millions of people are climbing from below the poverty line into the lower middle classes, and in the hundreds of thousands from the lower middle classes to the ordinary middle classes. Now, what that means for resources is quite extreme. Because as society moves from the most basic levels to the levels above them, their resource needs move up exponentially. Now, there's a supreme illogic to this, of course, because as people move from one strata to another, one of the things that goes concomitantly with that is, of course, education and education levels. And in spite of the higher levels of literacy around things like resources and the scarcity of resources, inevitably we increase our budgets for water, our budgets for energy, our budgets for food. And related to that is water waste, energy waste, and food waste. So this is a critical part of the Malthusian challenge of the 21st century. So its strain on water resources in general and groundwater in particular, you can see exactly where this is going. The second issue, to emphasize the point once more, is the issue of climate change. We have in our part of the world the extremes of increased desertification on the western side, and towards the center of the SADC region, a much bigger increase in the rainfall patterns and the flooding opportunities that go with it. And we have to deal with both. But the other factor that comes into play, and it's a really important factor, is that the economic strategy of each of our individual countries, without exception. The region as SADC and Africa as a continent has an economic strategy that has a trajectory that moves us closer and closer to a highly water-intensive economy. Whether you're looking at the Vision 2063, whether you're looking at the RISDP in SADC, and work has already begun on its successor, whether you're looking at the industrial and infrastructure strategy of the region, whether you're looking at the economic plans of individual countries like the National Development Plan of South Africa, the water intensity, the power intensity, and the calorie intensity with regards to food is extraordinarily high. And this is something that we have to deal with. So let's just look very briefly at some of the visitors to SADC. Now, one of the parameters I want to highlight, and you'll be very familiar with these indicators. I hope you're familiar with these indicators, because Bera and his colleagues work pretty hard in SADC House and Khabaroli to make sure they give us this data fairly regularly. The thing that I want to put out here is look at the GDP contributions. So the GDP contributions currently sit at 51% coming from services. And for many of our countries, this represents some measure of a ceiling. The industry component currently contributes 32% of the GDP, and our vision in the SADC region around our own development plan is for that to increase exponentially. We're talking about industrialization and modernization as the core driver of our development strategy, and the contribution of agriculture to GDP is 17%, which is very high. But even higher than that is the contribution to employment and livelihood of the agricultural sector. So, if you like, you can see the water intensity immediately. And what it says to you is that if you continue to use water along this trajectory in the way that we've been using water in the past, there is no way we're going to reconcile our demand and supply. Already in South Africa, in the projections that we have done, there's a big program actually, because it has several projects that the WRC does with the Institute for Security Studies and the University of Denver, the Parker Institute, says that our current scenarios of current use projected to 2030 will leave a country like South Africa with a 1.1 billion cubic meter deficit in 2030. This is a significant warning. So, moving on, and we look at the gross domestic product. Now, this is a very difficult measure, and there's a lot said about this measure, but use this as an indicator of the nature of the growth. And the growth prospects for the region, and the growth prospects for the continent as a whole, and the growth prospects for individual countries in the region is actually very high. So while we're talking about an average associated in 2016 at around 1.4%, which clearly is not high, we still have, as a continent, the highest number of countries that have had a greater than 7% growth rate for 10 years in succession compared to any other continent in the world at any time in history. This is a rapidly growing continent economically. And the latest figures are telling us a little bit of a different story. Am I clicking the wrong button? Sorry. So the World Bank Pulse Indicator, the World Bank has these meetings called the spring meetings, which I guess some of you are familiar with, where they revise their forecasts around many things, of course, and one of those things is the growth forecast for different parts of the world, and the regional growth forecast for Africa, as revised in April this year, is 3.1% for the 2018 year, moving up to 3.6% in the 2019-20 year. So I want to make this connection for you, to say that with this increased growth, if we are going to have this increased growth with the same paradigm, there is a concomitant increase on the demand for resources inside the system. Now, the nature of the economy as a whole is something that we should be looking at very carefully. The first issue is, what is the prospect around the ending of this crunch? Now, countries like South Africa are in a bind. We are currently, as you sit there, in a technical recession in this country. We had 2 successive quarters of negative growth, contraction to the economy. But this picture is not reflected in the rest of SADC. SADC is looking at this long crunch as being a much shorter crunch than some of the big players inside the region. So countries like Mauritius, countries like Rwanda are showing already a very positive growth stat. And there again, what does that mean around the resources in the region? So this glimmer of the new economic dawn seems to be something that is quite paramount as a total reflector in the region. And wherever you come from, the transition now from one president to another, 18 months in advance, has induced a huge amount of investor confidence, not only in Botswana, but in the region as a whole. So, the other phenomenon that we have to look at in the world today is that the world seems to be disinvesting in multilateralism as a mechanism to control aspects of the global system and replacing that with regional, sub-regional, and country-to-country bilateral. Now, this is largely driven by the United States and its new policy, but Trump has a range of followers that are pretty close behind him. Now, what does that mean for resources? What does that mean for our inter-country treaties? What does that mean for the SADC protocol around things like water? What does that mean around governance of shared systems? Because as we sit here, SADC is one of those places in the world that has the highest cooperation quotient in the world around the sharing of international waters. Is that now at risk? And in the domain of groundwater, which is even more difficult to govern than surface water, what does that mean? So we have to examine this in context. And there's a lot to internalize. And I think that groundwater is going to have a major, major part to play, not only in the water strategy for the region going forward, but in the overall development strategy for the region going forward. If we look at the environment, and this week's a pretty sad week for South Africa, as some of you will know, Minister Edna Molewa, who has been a championing fighter around climate change and environmental issues in this country, in this region, in fact in this whole continent for so many years, actually passed away last week, and we're all in a bit of mourning. But she also emphasized in the various speeches that she's been making that we have two worlds on the climate deal. And the two worlds on the climate deal have some very intimate implications for how we're dealing with the water issues in our part of the world. There's a change in the health risk profile. And you know this and I know this. We are now talking about tuberculosis in the north. We're talking about malaria in countries like South Africa. So the nature of the risk profile associated with these changes in global weather is very significant. There is clearly a need for new spatial development models. We are sitting on a continent right now that is predicted that by 2050, 2060, we'll have about 50 megacities on this continent. 50 cities that have more than 10 million inhabitants in those cities. Several of them don't exist yet. Currently, there are either small cities or big towns. The challenge that faces the continent, the opportunity that is available for the continent, is that we don't have to do what the Western Europeans and the North Americans are currently doing around retrofitting their cities to make them water sensitive. We can actually plan that off the bat in our region and organize for water sensitive cities to be there right from the fundamental plan. So we need to mobilize ourselves as a community of practice to influence this debate very, very strongly. And one of the core instruments available to be able to do this is we need a SADC initiative around the regulatory and standards tools that we use around how we govern those developments. We can use our national systems. In some cases, we have to go beyond the national systems. For example, non-sewage sanitation, led by a coalition of countries, two of which are from this continent, are now organized for an ISO tool to be part of the new standards and regulations. So let me talk about energy briefly. The energy forecast of the world is this picture, that there's going to be an increase in energy demand everywhere in the world. Now those represent the different continents. The little green in the middle is Africa. It is dwarfed somewhat by China and the rest of Asia. China and the rest of Asia is the pink and the black. and showing the largest increase. Essentially, it's China and India and a couple of other countries, but we can also see that the North American demand is going up exponentially. So we're looking at a world that is going to organize itself to have a much higher energy demand going into the future, and therefore a much higher energy supply. So the choices that we make around energy is absolutely critical. We can do what South Africa has done and make its biggest investment into new coal-powered power stations. Or we can be a lot wiser than that and organize for renewable energy and possibly nuclear energy to be the mainstay of the growth in your energy supply and organize for a sustainability that we need to engage. But this is a critical factor. And one of the most important factors actually affecting the water sector, and we do not pay enough attention to it. The last drought that happened in this city, which is as recent as 2 weeks ago, came on the back not of a shortened precipitation or lower levels in the dam, but because a very big substation for electricity burned down. And because of that, all of the hilly areas of Johannesburg, which is usually the wealthier folk, did not have water, because water could not be pumped. So this intimate relationship between water and energy is something we should not lose sight of. The Food Risk Index is telling us that in the world as a whole, we are doing well. That the number of people who have below the nutritional poverty level in the world has gone down drastically. However, the story for Africa, for sub-Saharan Africa in particular, is not as rosy. It has gone down a little bit, but it still is that part of the world that has the highest food risk. Now, the relationship between water and energy and food is an intimate one, and we know this. Agricultural production, as agricultural production, cannot happen without water and energy, and agro-processing in any form, which is one of the mainstay pillars of the SADC Economic Development Plan, depends very intimately on the availability of water and energy. The water challenge is something that you know very well. Now, this is a very old map. It comes from 1999. Unfortunately, very little has changed on that map. We still have the majority of countries on the African continent sitting in at least the scarcity domain, and all of them have a forecast to go into the stress domain and possibly into the vulnerable domain. And this continues to be the nature of the African water challenge. One of the interesting things in SADC as a region, it has some of the most water-rich countries in the world, together with some of the most water-poor countries in the world. And the highest level of productivity, the highest level of water-intensive productivity in the SADC region happens precisely in those countries that have the least water. Is this not something we should be thinking about? Is it not time that we brought back the discussion around virtual water, around having the water-intensive activities happening with the right kind of arrangements in those places that have the water, and have the servicing happening in those places that don't? Now, there are issues around sovereignty around this, clearly. There are issues around economic feasibility around this, clearly. But those things can be worked out. And it is time that we reintroduce this debate at beyond the philosophical level, at a very practical level. Can we reorganize for the water-rich parts of this region to become the new bread baskets or the new rice baskets? I'm not sure what the most modern term is. But the places that we depend on for the primary production, so that the other activities can happen in other parts of the world. The SADC water picture is something that you're pretty familiar with. The only thing to emphasize here is this disparity between the water-rich and the water-poor regions. And the water safety challenge is something that increases over time. Now, this is counterintuitive, because our reality should be that as our technology improves, and it has improved tremendously, as our know-how has improved, and is improved exponentially. I mean, over the last 20 years, according to Scopus, the productivity in the water sector, based on publication, has gone up 30% per year continuously over 20 years. We know far more about